The next item on the agenda is a topical subject, the debate on equality between men and women. We'll have the report by Ms. Mariya Reding on equality between women and men in 2010 for the Women's Rights and Gender Equality Committee, and the Plum report on female poverty. But we'll start with the report by Ms. Mariya Reding, who for 4 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President, Vice President of the European Commission, ladies and colleagues. I was born in 1979, where for the first time there were direct elections to the European Parliament. This same year, for the first time, a woman, Simone Veil, who was behind women's rights, became President of the European Parliament. Today, I will part of the 35% of women in this hemicycle. This figure has never been raised. So all these women who have the intelligence, the power and the courage to call for the right to vote, the right to work and education. All the women who just wanted to defend the respect of their dignity and their rights. So it's 100 years that we've been fighting to combat discrimination which is unjust. Considerable progress has been made indeed, but to combat inequality between men and women, it's a fight every day, and there's a lot that remains to be done. The European Union has always been in the avant-garde when it comes to equal opportunity between men and women, and I think our Parliamentary Assembly must make sure that we're at the forefront of this dynamic, even when it comes to the most sensitive subjects. The economic crisis which we're going through makes us aware of our own contradictions. As I say in the report, women have been more hardly and durably affected by the crisis. But as I also say, let's stop whining, let's make progress, let's make proposals, and let's move ahead. Today is important to underline the role of education to combat stereotypes. Let's make sure that there are more possibilities in terms of teaching, vocational training and employment on the basis of better access for women to higher levels of responsibility. It's also time to stop the gap in pay between men and women, and I also think that we have to move up a gear when we look at the composition of boards of companies, big companies. Only 3% of the members of boards in big companies, quoted companies, are women. I think that's not normal. So we have to press on the accelerate. And if, despite everything, big companies don't play along, we'll have to introduce quotas and coercive means. I'm not basically in favour of quotas, but if the carrot doesn't work, we'll have to apply the stick. It can't be denied. The presence of women in the labour market is beneficial in terms of economic growth. Today, the European relaunching project can work if the equality between men and women is integrated. Specific proposals to reconcile professional life, family and private life must be made to make sure that these aren't just dreams. It's not a question of values and ideals, but it's also a question of pragmatism and efficiency. Finally, Madam President, I would like to touch on a final point. I was happy to learn that the European Commission could come up with a proposal in spring for combating violence against women, and this is a scourge which we have to combat in all ways. I'd like to thank you, Madam Commissioner, for being so proactive in this area. Madam President, I'm not a pessimist, so I would like to finish on a positive note, a note of encouragement, if you'll allow me. I think today, when we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the International Women's Day, we have to salute the courage, the power and the determination of which the women in Tunisia, Libya, Iran, Egypt, Bahrain and other countries are fighting for human rights. This wind of freedom blowing through North Africa ought to blow away authoritarianism, poverty and social injustice, to emancipate women socially, politically and economically whilst respecting their traditions. That's our role in the Parliament. I'd like to salute them, encourage them, support them in their dogged fight for democracy and human rights. But let's be aware of the size of the task ahead of us. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Now, Ms. Plum, also reporter, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mrs. President, dear Commissioner, dear colleagues. First, let me wish to all women happy anniversary for this important day, the 8th of March, the day which marks 100 years of life, 100 years of struggle for women's rights. Then I would like to thank to all my colleagues, to the shadows, to the members of the Secretariat for their contributions to this report. My report deals with an issue which is both general and eminently concrete by its consequences, female poverty. 85 million Europeans live below the poverty line, and 70% of all women in the EU are ranked as living in poverty. These are the facts. The economic, financial and social crisis affect all of us, but it particularly harms women in the labour market and in their personal lives, since they are more likely to be in insecure jobs, more likely to be made redundant and less likely to have social security. This is how things stand at present. What can we do? The women are waiting from us for concrete proposals, for concrete measures. It's 8th of March and I tried to summarize my report in 8 points. First and foremost, we call on the Member States to take into account the gender dimension in their plans for recovery from the recession by promoting and boosting the employment of women and adopting specific measures, as well as to adjust budgets to ensure equality of access to public sector expenditure, with a view to both enhancing productive capacity and meeting women's social and environmental needs. Second, we call on the Commission and the Member States to take the appropriate measures to eliminate gender inequalities in employment as part of the EU 2020. I strongly encourage establishing as an objective the reduction of the gender pay gap by 1% each year in order to achieve a target of 10% reduction by 2020. I stress also the need for positive actions to increase women representation in political, economic and corporate decision-making bodies. The third issue is related to the reconciliation between private and professional life. I call on the Council and the Member States to renew and fulfil their commitments related to the Barcelona targets for the provision of accessible, affordable and high-quality childcare, and to develop new targets for the care of dependent persons. Fourth point, we call on the Commission and Member States to frame health policies which aim to combat and prevent practices that harm women's health and are cause of social exclusion and poverty. Fifth issue, we call on the Member States to adopt the necessary measures in order to offer better opportunities for women in education, while fighting stereotypes as well as eliminating traditional role models in school curricula. The sixth point is that there is a direct link between the social conditions of the families and children's growth. Therefore, we call the Commission and the Council to develop and implement a strategy to halve child poverty by 2012. 7 points, we should not ignore violence against women. It has an increasing impact on the risk of marginalization, poverty and social exclusion. I call on the Commission to establish a European year for combating violence against women. And 8 points, let's underline the importance of the structural funds, in particular the European Social Fund, as a key tool for assisting Member States to combat poverty and social exclusion. I think that we can do it. We have the power, we have the force, the intelligence to tackle this important issue at European level and in all Member States. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The Vice President of the Commission, Mrs. Reding.
It is nice, Madam President, that on the 100th anniversary of the International Women's Day, this House is guided by a woman. I think that is also very symbolic. And it is also symbolic that we can, during this day, debate these very important issues which are on the agenda, thanks to the rapporteur, Mariya Nedelcheva, which shows a great support for the Commission's work towards gender equality and focuses on important issues that the Commission has and will continue to emphasise. 100 years of struggle, and we do not see the end of it. I regret that, because I always hope that we can eliminate, if you want, the yearly celebration of the struggle of women, but as long as we have not arrived there, we cannot do so, and we have not arrived there. The report of the Parliament shows very clearly what are the gaps. The gaps are in poverty. We have heard the second report on this too. In poverty, women are leading. So there is not a gap in this sense, but what are we doing, and my colleague László Andor will answer to this, in order to get the women out of the poverty trap. The second element is women in the active world. Well, there is a problem still on the balance between family life and professional life. There is the problem of the pay gap, where women still earn 17% less in average than men, and you might have seen that on the 5th of March we had the European Gender Pay Gap Day, with measurements to see how much women have to work more than men in order to reach the same level of pay. Well, we were not paid until the 5th of March. We had to work without being paid. Only from the 5th of March on we start to be paid. I hope that one day we can have the Gender Pay Gap Day on the 1st of January, which means that there would be equal pay at that moment. The political commitment of the European Commission is contained in our new strategy. The themes which are mentioned in our strategy for gender equality are the same that the rapporteur has mentioned: economic independence for women, gender pay gap, violence against women, and promoting gender equality in external actions. To start with the external actions, you might have seen the intervention of Cathy Ashton and myself for the 8th of March, speaking to the women outside of Europe and greeting the courage of all these women who are fighting to survive and who are fighting to have democracy established. We need to make it clear that we are by their side. And speaking about all these upheavals, and speaking about the wars, and speaking about the genocides which unfortunately continue to go on, you know that women are in the first row. Women and children are the most vulnerable in our societies, but also in the societies outside. And that is why the Commission is working to streamline its various policy initiatives on violence against women, and to create synergies between areas with similar objectives. So here we are developing a coherent policy response to tackle this huge problem. So my link is concrete actions in areas where there are clear legal bases in order to have efficiency. And in this sense, I am going to present a victims' rights package in May this year, where of course legislation to help women and children will be very high on the agenda. Maybe I should finish with a theme which was high on the agenda these last days, because you know, the 1st of March I brought around the table the CEOs of big European listed companies. in order to tell them that we do not agree anymore with the 90% quota for men in boards, because that is what is happening. There is only 1 woman for 10 men on boards, which means a 90% de facto quota for men. So we think that this should be tackled mainly because all the economic evidence, the scientific evidence on the economic functioning shows very clearly that companies with an equilibrated decision making structure do more return on investment, do more benefits than companies with a solely male decision making structure. So women mean business. It is in the interest of the economic development that women take more responsibility. And here I have challenged the publicly listed companies in Europe to sign a Women on the Board pledge for Europe by March 2012, to pledge to replace outgoing gentlemen of the board by qualified women, and there are so many that it should not be difficult to find these women. We are going to see, to observe, to analyse, to count what is happening between today and the 8th of March next year, and if nothing changes, then I am prepared to take action at EU level to redress the gender balance in corporate boardrooms.
Thank you very much, Vice President Reding. You put things in a very symbolic way. I'll now give the floor to Commissioner Andor.
You have the floor, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Madam President, honourable members. This is indeed a remarkable anniversary, and it's a great responsibility to participate in this discussion. I wish to thank first of all the rapporteurs from the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality and the Associated Committee on Employment and Social Affairs, respectively, for their report, which is very timely, because the issue it highlights has been on the agenda for a while, but it has become more pressing as a result of the impact of the financial and economic crisis on vulnerable groups in society. So let me highlight some of the key elements in my employment and social policies that I believe will improve the working opportunities and conditions of women. There are indeed urgent measures that the Member States need to take in these areas. For instance, they need to reduce the labour market segmentation by readjusting the balance in employment protection legislation between those workers on permanent contracts and those on time-limited precarious contracts, which is so often the case of women. They also need to strike a better balance between work and private or family life and remove other disincentives to participation in the workforce by second earners, who again are mostly women. It is important to increase the employment rate in the EU, and the key challenge in this area is the participation in the labour market by older workers, both male and female. In the future, I believe that the European Social Fund will have to be better used, more robustly used, to support the demand-side policies to open new opportunities for women, especially those returning to the labour market after childbirth. Honourable members, it is a source of great concern to the Commission that over 80 million people are at risk of poverty in today's European Union. The Member States hold the main responsibility for fighting against poverty, but the Union has a role to play. That's what more than three-quarters, 74% of our fellow Europeans believe, according to the Eurobarometer surveys. The flagship initiative, European Platform Against Poverty and Social Exclusion, includes proposals for practical measures to achieve the numerical poverty reduction target. The platform focuses on the continuing importance of active inclusion for people furthest from the labour market. As I have already pointed out, women make up an important component of that category. In 2012, the Commission will present a communication assessing in depth the implementation of active inclusion strategies at national level. I mentioned that more than 80 million are at risk of poverty in today's EU. What is even more worrying is that over 20 million children are among them, and the figure has not improved over time. Helping lift those children out of poverty means helping to lift their parents out of poverty too, in particular the single parents, who are mostly women. This calls for a multidimensional approach covering employment policies to help parents find work, the design of tax benefit systems, the provision of key services such as housing, quality childcare and education, and protection of children's rights. As foreseen in the platform, the Commission intends to put forward a recommendation in 2012 on child poverty. It will outline common principles and effective monitoring tools to combat and prevent poverty in early life. Honourable Members, providing the funding to meet those challenges is also crucial. Almost one-third of the European Social Fund's allocation of €21.7 billion for the present programming period goes on measures to improve access to employment. In addition, almost €3 billion, 2.77 to be precise, from that allocation goes on supporting self-employment and business start-ups, and the beneficiaries are very often women. In addition, the European Progress Microfinance Facility has recently been established to support job creation and self-employment. The facility provides loans to people who have lost their jobs and want to start up or develop their own small businesses. It pays special attention to women and young people. A budget of €100 million has been made available over 4 years, but can be increased to more than €500 million in a joint initiative with the international financial institutions. Over the last 10 years, EU cooperation under the open method of coordination on social inclusion and social protection has helped to raise awareness and promote the fight against poverty and social exclusion. The European Platform Against Poverty and Social Exclusion set the frame to reduce poverty across the whole range of policy areas. Let us do our utmost to make sure it achieves its aim. Thank you very much.
Grazie Commissario. Ora...
Thank you, Commissioner. Now I'd like to call Ms. Hirsch for the Employment and Social Affairs Committee. Thank you, Madam President. In drawing up the opinion, I concentrated on the employment market, and there is still a 17% difference in wages and salaries. We still don't have enough women in boards, so there is an urgent need for change here. We can no longer ignore the potential of young women and girls in this way. They're well trained, society has invested in them and in their mothers. And we now need to tell companies that the time has come for deeds, not words. Companies now need to make a step towards a voluntary quota. On the other hand, in terms of equality of opportunity, we need to remember that men have some disadvantages. Young men, for example, don't always have the possibility of staying at school to develop themselves there. There is a shortage of people for childcare and healthcare, and men could work more there. They should have the opportunity to pursue their talents regardless of gender.
Grazie, sempre per la
Thank you. Still for the Committee on Employment and Social Affairs, Mrs. Zimmer, for 1 minute.
Vor 100 Jahren
100 years ago, women called for the active and passive right to vote, and today we're calling for equal opportunities for women in professional life, career, but also in terms of equal pay for equal work, in particular in old age. And that isn't just a question of the gender pay gap. Women are more affected by poverty by men. That's proved by statistics throughout 27 member states. This feminization of poverty has many reasons. For time reasons, I can only touch on one: the increase of precarious jobs, discriminates jobs many times over. Over 30% of women work in part-time work, but it's only 7.4% of men who do that. Studies prove that even within these part-time jobs, women are much worse paid than men for the same time, for the same activity. So there are lesser chances for professional inclusion and careers. So there is less pension accruing to women. So poverty is pre-programmed, and a work without work, as we see it, cannot be achieved. And we need to extend social security systems. We need to have minimum wages, minimum pensions, and a general reduction of working times. We don't just want to find out in 100 years from now that it is the right, these are the rights of women, and to find out that women are able to live independent of the decisions of men.
Thank you. Now we start the debate with speakers for the political group, starting with the group of the European People's Party. Mrs. Matera for 2 minutes. Thank you, President. On the day where we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the International Women's Day, we are voting for 2 reports which deal with subjects which keep women marginalized or excluded from society. Women are traditionally at greater risk of poverty, particularly single mothers and women above the age of 55. Among the 5 aims proposed by the European Commission in its Europe 2020 strategy, there's a recognition of poverty, which makes Mrs. Plum's strategy extremely topical, particularly in terms of gender policy and in the light of the economic and financial crisis. The vulnerability of the woman makes her liable to poverty, social exclusion and loneliness. So it's our duty to intervene, to suggest specific programs and strategies. I'd like to congratulate Mrs. Nedelcheva for a good report encouraging equality between men and women in the European Union. Women's representation in the public and private sector is very low relative to that of men. In economic terms, the figures are even worse. Women represent only 10% of board members of the main European companies quoted on stock exchange, and 3% of the directors, 3% of the managing directors of such companies. So we need quotas for women in public and privately owned boards, and we need structures so that we can prevent teachers directing their pupils on the basis of old-fashioned stereotypes into specific careers. Let me conclude that one of the first women mayors in America said women have to work twice as hard to get half as much recognition as men. Let me conclude by saying that unfortunately, happily, it's an easy thing for women to do that. Thank you. For the S&D group, Mrs. Blinkevičiūtė for 1 minute.
Šiandien minint 100-asias tarptautinės moters dienos metinės, parlamente skiriam ypatingą dėmesį lyčių lygybei.
Thank you very much. Today it's the International Women's Day, and 100 years ago women were fighting for their right to work, and today they have to fight to get the same pay for the same job. This has taken a long time, too long, and we're seeing segregation and separation in the labour markets. We're seeing too few women in politics and in decision-making positions. In our report on equality between women and men, we noted that it's important to underscore the status of women. The conditions have to be put in place to allow childcare facilities, preschool childcare to be made available, and to recognise women and the role that they play in the development of society and in the economy as well. The member states have to do their fair share of the work as well. I'd like to congratulate all women on this day of all days and like to defend successfully their rights to equality. Thank you.
Grazie per il gruppo.
Thank you. Now for the ALDE group, I call Mrs. Parvanova for a minute and a half.
Madam Commissioner, dear colleagues, first of all, let me congratulate all my colleagues for the fruitful work done during the years as summarised in the Inequality Between Men and Women report and the crucial issue of female poverty addressed by Mrs. Plum's report. While celebrating the 100th anniversary of International Women's Day, it is crucial that this House take the measures of the long way we still have to go to ensure and mainstream gender equality across the Union in all sectors, in all aspects. Let's start with the employment sector and the gender pay gap. How long will we stay contemplating statistics showing that the equal positions women can be paid up to 34% less than men in some of the EU member states? We must push for measures, even legislative if necessary, to achieve concrete results in the reality, not only on paper. The place of women within the European labour market and the numerous obstacles and discrimination they have to face contribute to the rising phenomenon of women's poverty. Too many women remain in a position of relative economic insecurity and dependence. They tend to be concentrated in part-time and temporary jobs, less paid or in inferior positions. Poverty gives the rise of trafficking in women, to violence and more generally to exploitation of all kinds. We also know that the results of poverty, women victims of domestic violence, prefer not to take steps for protection because of lack of financial security. And on this symbolic day, Madam Reding, we are expecting the EU strategy to combat violence against women as it was already promised by you. Thank you very much.
Grazie per il gruppo.
Thank you. Now for the ALDE group, Mrs. Cornelissen for 2 minutes.
8 maart 2000.
8th of March 211, it's the 100th anniversary of the International Women's Day. I think we should be very pleased about what we've achieved. The franchise for women, equal treatment and reproductive rights as well, at least in the more civilized countries. But it also calls for reflection on everything that is not going in the right direction. Women in the EU are still underrepresented in decision-making areas, and care tends to fall heavily on the shoulders of women. There are clear wage disparities between women and men, and outside the EU, where some countries haven't even started pressing for the franchise for women. The 100th International Women's Day calls for a historical perspective as well. The biggest step to getting women on the labour market took place during the Second World War. Quite simply, there were not enough men to do all the work in factories and offices. Women didn't have a choice anymore, and they had to join the labour market, and they did in high numbers. This sort of period is returning in similar form, but fortunately not because of a war, but because of ageing, the greying of the population. In 5 to 10 years, simply there'll be too few men to fill all the posts at all levels. Employers will have to bring women on board and maintain them as well. And this provides an excellent opportunity for equal opportunities. And it's up to us as European politicians and our colleagues in national parliaments to stimulate this development and to foster it. There should be good maternity and paternity leave available with affordable childcare opportunities, with possibilities for flexible and part-time work, with accompanying flanking social rights, with a possibility to put your career on pause as well. I think these are things that would be very good. Together we can make sure that it won't have to take another 100 years before women and men are on an equal footing on every level and have equal opportunities. Thank you.
Grazie per il gruppo.
Thank you. Now for the ECR group, Mrs. ČEŠKOVÁ for 1 minute.
Vážená paní předsedkyně.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm a shadow rapporteur on the women of poverty in the EU, and therefore let me concentrate on this report. This report contains a number of aspects that describe the position of women in the EU. glad that there is a number of paragraphs that point out the necessity of using flexible forms of work contracts, such as part-time work or limited work contracts. And this is important because some women, or in general family with small children, need to be able to use a wide range of different working practices in order to reconcile their private and professional lives. And I also welcome the reference to the need to reduce the pay gap. And quickly, let me also say that the report also contains some aspects that we could not support, such as the call for the creation of a women's charter, a women's rights charter, or also the need to increase maternity leave. And in this sense, we're going to present our amendments. But I would also like to thank the rapporteur because the report is very good. Thank you.
Grazie per il gruppo.
Thank you. For the Confederal Group of the European United Left, Chair Svensson for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam President. 100 years of fighting for equality. I think it's important today that we also reflect on those pioneers who 100 years ago started the fight for equality, who have really paved the way for the progress that we can note has been achieved. I'd also like to thank all colleagues, NGOs, all of those who are continuing the good fight for equality. We are to discuss the situation of women in the EU, but I think today it's also important that we show our solidarity with those women who, at the current juncture, are showing great courage by participating in the struggle that's going on the streets for democracy and human rights elsewhere in the world. I think we should think about them as well. The reports that we're looking at today are shedding light on the inequalities of labour markets at the moment, where women have insecure jobs, where there's wage discrimination to the tune of 17% in average, where only 6 of 10 European women are in gainful employment, and where they do have a job, they're often insecure part-time jobs, which they can't really earn a living off. It's not really remarkable because there are very strong powers which are fighting against this, fighting against the extension of childcare, for example, which provide the preconditions for women to have gainful employment. The possibilities for women to get involved in gainful employment means that we have to fight the fight for maternity leave, the maternity leave directive, which I hope will also include paternity leave. I hope we'll be talking about parental leave insurance in the near future, so that men and women can share responsibility for earning their crust, but also for caring for children. If women in the EU worked as much as men in the EU did, then we would increase prosperity by over a quarter. We cannot afford to forego equality. There needs to be quotas. I think quotas are a necessary instrument in a society where only 3% of large companies are led by women. I could compare the use of quotas to the use of antibiotics. I don't like the exaggerated use of antibiotics, but if somebody is ill, I'm extremely pleased that they exist. And there's something sick with our society where only 3% of leadership of companies are held by women, and that is why quotas are a necessary tool to correct that mistake that exists in society. Thank you.
Grazie per il gruppo Europa della Libertà.
Thank you. Now for the Europe of Freedom and Democracy group, Mr. Bloom for 1 minute.
Well, there's a lot of self-congratulation going on here in the European Union on International Women's Day. It's my opinion that you've made a complete dog's breakfast of it. You talk about maternity leave. All that's happening with draconian maternity leave, madam, let me tell you, is that fewer and fewer young women in my country are getting jobs because you'd have to be stark staring mad to employ a young woman if you have a small business. So you've done them no favours. We have equal opportunities for car insurance now due to another lunatic judgment by a European court, which means if young women even could get a job, they couldn't afford to drive to it because they've just had their car insurance doubled. And now you're talking about quotas. What kind of madness is this? Women who've worked all their lives to get to a position of responsibility in business, professional women, are being patronised on quotas. Now they'll sit in a boardroom, those women who have been successful, and people will look across at that boardroom and say, are you a token woman, or did you get there because you know your business? The whole thing is completely crazy, and it's a tragedy that none of you have done a real job in your lives, or you would understand this.
Mr. Bloom, do you accept a blue card by Madam Svensson? Please.
I have. Mr. Bloom, man inte
Mr. Bloom, you're not stark raving mad if you want parental insurance and you deem it to be a good thing. You can just look at the member states who do have a well-developed parental insurance system. It is the case that in those countries, in the Nordic countries, in Sweden for example, they also enjoy the highest share of female employment. And that proves that good parental insurance actually means that you will also have higher employability rates and employment rates for women and men as well. So parental insurance is good for equality on the labour market, and women can contribute to the prosperity of the EU as well.
This is simply not true and not borne out by the statistics in my country. Speak to any small businessman you like in my country. I'm not interested in your country or other people's countries. I'm interested in my country and my economy. And I will tell you that all businessmen and businesswomen will say they will not employ young women because of the draconian maternity laws. I desperately wish you would come into the real world. Hands up, any of you who've had a real job.
Mr. Bloom, do you accept another blue card? So, please, Madame OVIIR.
Thank you, President. Mr. Bloom, you know that in the European Union women have better education than men, including your home country. Then why do you think when we establish quotas for companies, why do you think the companies then hire their uneducated women?
I would simply counsel you, madam, to let companies do their business, and the less you regulate, the less you tax, the less you interfere, the quicker our economy will recover. That's what it's all about, and that's something you simply don't understand.
Another blue card? The last one? Madame Estrela, please.
Thank you, Madam President. Mr. Bloom, do you know what the United Kingdom's problem is? It's got 52 weeks of badly paid maternity leave, and only the first 6 weeks are paid at 60%. And the other 33 weeks are paid just symbolically, and then there are 13 weeks which are not paid at all. So it means that only rich families can leave their women at home without the family budget suffering. That's the United Kingdom's problem, and it's not the problem with our maternity leave proposals.
I can assure you that the problem with my country is that we've given up self-government, and we're members of the European Union. That's my country's problem.
Card, do you accept? really the last one. Please.
Arvoisa puheenjohtaja.
Madam President, I would like to thank Mr. Bloom, actually, for his opinions, because these are fairly widespread. Otherwise, we would have made a lot of progress. There are just a lot of people who are silent. I'd just like to ask you, Mr. Bloom, do you think that children are only the children of women and fathers don't have any responsibility? They don't have to have paternity leave or, in other ways, take care of their family, just to have to go to work?
I believe, madam, that children are the responsibility of their parents and nobody else. I do not accept that somebody takes responsibility for his neighbour's children. It is for the parents to take responsibility of their children, and that's how it should be. And the more self-responsibility that we have in Europe, and indeed the world, the better the place would be, in my view.
Bene, proseguiamo il dibattito.
Let us continue with the debate. And next we have for the non-attached members Mrs. WERTHMANN for 1 minute.
Colleagues, Madam Commissioner, that we're still speaking about equal opportunities is a proof of the problems in our society. Women are disadvantaged not just in work but also in societal life. The list seems to be endless. We talk about wage levels, working conditions, precarious conditions, pensions, childcare, various forms of violence against women. There are women who are better qualified than men, but we're still talking about the same equal pay for equal work. Unbelievable. Also unbelievable that women are more exposed to poverty than men. In particular, older women and single parents are particularly exposed to poverty. In 2010 was the year for fighting poverty. Poverty hasn't gone away, and there are consequences for society. Poverty can make people sick and can lead to unemployment.
All'onorevole Bauer.
No, I call Mrs. Bauer for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Today we here in Parliament are dealing with two issues, the basis for which are found in the reports of my two colleagues. It's difficult to say anything new in this situation because the situation, far from having not changed, it's actually got worse. When it comes to the wage disparities between women and men, again and again, every year, we iterate that these disparities are huge. Even though the Treaty of Rome in 1957 said that there was a principle of equal pay for work of equal value. Now, we discuss these issues quite often, and there are rules that have been set, but they're not being kept to. And statistics indeed show that the differences persist. And the current differences that exist constitute 17.5%. Now, some of us may remember that a few years ago we had disparities of 15% on average. And the spread of this is quite large. It is not just a question of small companies or large companies. It's not necessarily just a problem for women. It's a problem of social justice in society. The disparities in wages are almost a punitive measure for motherhood. And when women return to the labour market, they are confronted with these wage disparities again. Small and medium-sized companies are never going to resolve the problems we have in our society. The Parliament has requested that wage disparities are made more transparent, and it is those who are violating the rules who shouldn't be allowed to have access to EU funds, but that's not actually happening. Well, we've had a bit of progress. We've introduced an equal pay day, but a huge achievement would be if we had it on the 1st of January. Thank you.
Grazie. La parola
Thank you. Now I call Mrs. Estrela for 1 minute. Thank you, Madam President. Women are the majority in universities and they get more qualifications. But then when it comes to decision-taking bodies, they run into the glass ceiling that stops them from rising. That's why we need quotas. It's a pity Mr. Bloom's just left. We need them in politics and we need them in the economy. There isn't a single woman governor of a central bank. Women weren't responsible for the financial crisis, but they could have helped to avoid it. So when you talk about quotas, people suddenly start talking about merit. But does merit not apply to men? The quota is a necessary transitional measure to achieve an equal representation of men and women in decision-taking. That's why I congratulate the Commission on the work that it's doing to ensure that on the economic side as well there is equality, there is sharing of decision-taking.
Grazie. La parola.
Thank you. Mrs. OVIIR for 1.5 minutes.
Tänan, proua president.
Thank you very much, and happy International Women's Day to everyone. With regard to gender equality, it's not only an issue of being different or an issue of social justice. It is an important issue, a precondition for the functioning of the economy. It is good to ensure better women's employment. This increases tax revenue and sustainable birth rates in society. Our understanding of gender equality is very often on the level of the Middle Ages. This we heard also in several speeches today. Many people are afraid of quotas, but we tend to forget, or we don't see, that quotas do not bring stupid women to different posts and jobs. Women are able to take responsibility and earn an equal wage for equal work. The countries which started using quotas already some 20 years ago, for example Nordic countries, have demonstrated that this can be a useful measure, and society has changed as a result, and quotas are actually no longer even needed today, because society considers it normal that women participate in all aspects of society. I would like to talk about many things, poverty, single mothers and so on, but I don't have enough time today. Thank you very much to everybody who made good speeches, and one day we will win. Thank you.
Grazie. La
Thank you. I call Mrs. Brandner for 1.5 minutes.
100 years of women's rights is reason to celebrate and to be grateful and to reflect. Here we have some reports that uncover the disparities between wages for women and men. The treaties of Rome since 1957 have included the principle of equal pay for work of equal value. 17.5% is the average in the EU, it's 23% in Germany. Recently we adopted a report on equal pay, thanks to Mrs. Bauer's excellent work, and the Commission was called on to bring about some indicators and to limit and restrict wage disparities, but nothing, absolutely nothing has happened since then. And you, Mrs. Reding, Commissioner, everything that you have achieved is that the 4th of March should be declared the International Pay Day for Europe. I'm pleased that you managed to get that through before the day came and went. We would like you to become active now so that the 100th anniversary of the Treaties of Rome shouldn't be an issue of looking at finding genuine equality. we want equal pay now. To my English colleague, I'd like to know if he believes if in England and around Europe that only 3% of women know how to do their business. That would only be the reason why so few women are in management boards. That's not really how it is. That's why we need a quota. Mrs. Reding, you said that companies should undertake an obligation to appoint women. Would you like them to put forward the pledges by next year, or would you like them to have appointed the women by next year? I hope it's the latter.
Grazie. La parola.
Thank you. Mr. Szymański for 1 minute.
Pani Przewodnicząca.
Madam Chairman, in this resolution we raise an extremely important issue, that is the poverty of women. One should bear in mind that it is women who bear the brunt of the financial crisis. They are the first to feel the negative effects because of layoffs and the effects of lower pay and restructuring. Moreover, they combined responsible parental functions with presence in a very difficult changing labour market. The situation of women in the EU is very diverse. This is why solidarity is so important, combined with understanding for women in regions where poverty is extremely important. The gender pay gap is troubling. We are concerned by the fact that those inequalities also happen in companies which are owned or managed by women. This leads you to wonder whether the causes may not be more deeply rooted and whether administrative rules and law are good enough. Perhaps we should change the mindset. Nothing will replace the respect and general social culture. Law in itself isn't enough. Thank you.
La parola all'onorevole.
Now I give the floor to Mrs. Figueiredo for 2 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam President. It's particularly significant that this year we're talking about the International Women's Day, and these reports try to point out the inequality and discrimination which persists. In fact, in some countries there's even been regression in society. There's been a historic struggle of women for recognition and for rights, but we have to see that unemployment and labour insecurity is getting worse. There are low wages, there's wage discrimination, and there's discrimination on the grounds of maternity that affect women workers, and these are particularly shocking and unacceptable in the young generations. Loss of income is extending itself ever more widely and to women. Particularly the situation of immigrant, handicapped, or low-wage women on low wages, or women who are retired, are all in particularly worrying situations. And people in the countryside, people on family farms, or people running SMEs or one-woman companies are particularly at risk. There are countries like Portugal, Greece, and Ireland where many parts of women's lives are being reduced in value. Fewer women are being let into universities, are being given jobs. There is less social security support and various other forms of support. So way beyond the crisis context, we see here measures undermining women's equality of rights and undermining social and economic cohesion. It's not enough to have fine words and statements of fine intentions. It's time to break with the neoliberal policies in the Stability and Growth Pact, with liberalization, with privatization and freedom of competition, always for the benefit of the stronger economic groups. There needs to be more rights, more economic and social cohesion, more equality if we want a better society. We need that way to protect human rights and to protect the major achievements of civilization that women helped to build.
Grazie. La parola all'onorevole Jiménez.
Thank you, Mrs. Jiménez Becerril, for a minute and a half. This is a very significant day on which to talk about equality between men and women, because it is Women's Day. And we recall those who 100 years ago were fighting for economic and labour rights and for women's votes. We've made a lot of progress in these 100 years, but a lot still needs to be done. true equality is still a dream, and discrimination against women is a reality. Each of us, men and women, can do much more to achieve real emancipation for women. There are many women in the world whose right to life is being threatened, whose dignity is being violated, and whose freedom is being denied. Allow me on this day, on this Women's Day, to show my support to all those women who in the revolutions of North Africa are fighting for their democratic rights. Women cannot be worth half as much as men in Arab countries or anywhere else in the world. We are all worth the same. We all deserve the same, and I shall go on fighting to achieve that. And until there is such equality, there will have to go on being a Women's Day, although many people don't want to understand this. The fact is that there are women getting paid half as much as men. There is violence in the home that affects women and children above all. And I say again, we have to go on speaking out in Parliament against all these things, and I can promise that I shall certainly do that. Thank you.
Grazie. La parola all'onorevole Tarabella.
Thank you. I call Mr. Tarabella for 1 minute.
First of all, I would like to salute the work done by Mrs. Nedelcheva and Mrs. Plum. This symbolic day, the 100 years of International Women's Day, I could make the same speech as I did a year ago. When it comes to the fighting violence against women, we are still expecting for the Commission to accede to our demand to create a European year and come up with a strategy. Equal pay, unfortunately, isn't a reality despite the efforts of Member States and the European Commission in particular. Paternity leave has unfortunately been turned down by the Member States despite the best efforts of Parliament, and the right to abortion is not recognised in 4 Member States and is questioned in others. I salute the new Belgian law on women in boards and the efforts by Mrs. Reding and President Buzek. And in 100 years we've done 50% of the work towards gender equality. Let's hold the course so that it doesn't take another 100 years to achieve true gender equality.
Grazie.
Thank you. Now I call Ms. McClarkin for 1 minute.
Madam Chair, as many of you have pointed out, the progress of women's rights has moved steadily forward over a number of years. In the 30 years between the first election of the European Parliament and when I was elected in 2009, the representation of women has more than doubled. We now see women in major roles in politics, business, industry and the media. Perhaps most importantly, as a society, we have come to appreciate the necessity of the role of women and recognising their contribution, winning equality along the way. However, we need to be mindful of how far we push calls for more equality and in what areas. Our concerns should be focusing on what is still wrong today. In the UK, women still account for less than 20% of the members of Parliament. Nearly half of all the companies in the FTSE 250 have no females in the boardroom at all, and only a fifth of all engineering, science and IT graduates are women. Given the diverse nature of our societies, this is clearly something that Member States need to address without quotas and targets arbitrarily set at an EU level. But more than representation, there are thousands of women across the EU and indeed the world who endure violence, exploitation and exclusion. They are the ones without a voice. It is these women who suffer from discrimination, are deliberately discouraged from achievement or are victims of repression who surely deserve our absolute attention.
Grazie. La parola.
Thank you. Now I call Mrs. Lulling for 1.5 minutes.
Oui, merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam President, in German. First of all, I'd like to welcome the few men who have managed to join the midst of the many women here. Of course, I'm in favour of equal treatment and equality between women and men, and that is why at national and European level I've been fighting for more than 50 years, and I think successfully so. Unfortunately, the report on equality between women and men in the EU for 2010 is a little exaggerated, which will only be counterproductive for women. These recommendations, which I don't have time to name in detail, it's not the fault of the rapporteurs, but the whole raft of this sort of amendments have made this report less than digestible. The issue of women's quotas for publicly listed companies, we should be careful of praising Norway as a model example. Why? Well, from the introduction of a women's quota in 2003 until 2009, the number of women involved in the boards in companies has gone down from 554 to 262. There are very few women involved, but they tend to be by way of a token in the boards of companies. Now, I think the Commission will have to reflect long and hard before they undertake any sort of knee-jerk reactions to change this policy. I regret as well that in this report every now and again there's a question of making freer access for women to abortion and other forms of contraception. I don't think abortion can be used as a form of contraception, and regardless of the fact that the EU doesn't have competence here, subsidiarity oblige, I think this is something that should not be foisted on us in this sort of report. Thank you.
Madame Lulling, il y a trois...
Mrs. Lulling, there are 3 blue cards. All right?
Onorevole Ronzulli, prego.
Mrs. Ronzulli. A very simple question to Mrs. Lulling, please, madam. Doesn't she believe that positions like hers, positions expressed by a woman, that is, mean that equality between men and women has got further away in 2011 precisely because of this experience that she's still telling us all about?
Moi, je ne sais pas.
Well, I don't know. I didn't say why the situation is getting worse, but if we remain realistic, it won't get worse, but it will get worse if we're utopian and unrealistic.
Onorevole Tarabella.
Mr. Tarabella, please.
Madame Lulling. Mrs. Lulling, if I could be very proud for when you thank the men present, I'm one of the few members of the Women's Committee. I'm vexed if you lump me together with Mr. Bloom. I think you should distinguish between Mr. Bloom and me. And I'm sorry that you're putting us together because we have very different positions.
Well, Mr. Tarabella, I didn't mention Mr. Bloom. You have done a great service to Mr. Bloom because you put questions to him and he had an opportunity to take the grandstand here. I'd like to thank you for putting questions to me as well, because that means I've had time, speaking time here. But I have to admit, Mr. Tarabella, that you are an eminent member of the Women's Committee. I can always count on you to put across the voice of reason. And I do regret that in some passages in these reports, you and I unfortunately didn't see eye to eye.
Grazie. La parola.
Thank you. Now I call Mrs. Gurmai for 1 minute.
It's the anniversary of International Women's Day, while we are debating the Plum report on the face of female poverty and the Nadja report on equality between women and men in the European Union. When the institutions are focusing on quotas for women on board, PS Women dedicates its 2011 campaign to the issue of pension system and to female poverty. All European societies are facing ageing populations, and pension systems all over Europe are being reformed. That's why the EU must send a signal that the lives of ordinary women are central to our concern. On the fundamental issues of pension, the European Commission should be leading the charge in closing the structural gaps between women and men. Women should not be disadvantaged for reasons beyond their power. Pay gap, as my colleagues mentioned, taking care of relatives, indecent work. Our first task is to raise awareness among women. then we need to underline that during the ongoing discussions on pensions, the female factor has come up very rarely. We want policymakers to be aware of these effects and make sure that precise data on women and pensions becomes available. The Commission needs to conduct research on the gendered effect of pension reforms in Europe, and I am sure that Viviane Reding will do this job. Look at the best practices at national levels and look into a European approach. I think it is really time to think about what we have achieved during the last 100 years, and we need a clear future for our children. And of course, what is also important to remind us what Clara Zetkin did, because gender pay gap, that was her idea, and that was 100 years ago. So I would say it is really very important to make changes like Ginger Roger and Fred Astaire, because Ginger Roger had to do everything on high heels and backwards. Thank you very much for your cooperation, dear President.
Durch den Wechsel zwischen
Well, there's been a change between Mrs. Angelilli and myself in the chair, which gave you an extra half a minute. The next speaker now is Mrs. Kolarska-Bobinska for 1 minute and a half.
Dziękuję.
Thank you. In the two reports on inequalities between men and women, there are a number of suggestions what to do in order to reduce those inequalities. And I'd like to thank Commissioner for all the steps that are being taken at the European level in order to reduce the differences between men and women. But these steps have to be taken at the member state level, and here I can see a number of problems. And therefore, women's organizations appeal to the European Commission for help. But it is key for people to act at the grassroots level. And we have such examples in Poland. We have a movement, Women's Congress, and we have collected, for example, 100,000 signatures to have resolution, and we, in the Polish Parliament, we have a 35% quota for elections for women, and I am proud that Poland is the first new member state that will introduce such an important new change, and we will see how this will pan out and how women will be encouraged to participate in political life. We should have new targets, and we should first of all try to reduce the differences in pay between men and women.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. Costa for 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President, Commissioner, and thanks also to the rapporteurs. This 8th of March I'd like to dedicate to the women of North Africa who are now demonstrating in Cairo and indeed in Iran as well, demonstrating for the freedom of their countries. I hope that there will be a strong action from the External Service of the European Commission to link up with these women. There's a great awakening in Europe about women's involvement, calling for dignity for women in the media and the behavior of men in institutions. Thousands of Italian women called for this in squares across Italy recently. There's a strong link between the insecure conditions of work and life of women and the inadequate protection of pregnancy for people, usually women, in non-typical contracts. That's all connected with the lower activity rate for women and the lower level of pension for women and decisions about careers. They're all tied together. One last point. I agree with Commissioner Reding on boards. I don't agree so much about insurance, which could penalize all women. Without this, we're not going to get to Europe 2020.
Es gibt eine Zwischenfrage.
There's a question from colleague Sver.
Okay, Entschuldigung.
Catch the eye, sorry.
Die nächste Rednerin.
The next speaker is Mrs. Morin-Chartier for 1 minute 30. Thank you, Madam President. Madam Commissioner, dear friends. First of all, I'd like to say, for me, the fighting for gender equality isn't a fight of left or right. It's not a fight between men or women. It's a fight in society. Which society today could invest in training of young girls, as we did, doing without 50% of intelligence in professional life? This mustn't be the society that we live in. I ask for a general mobilization, both in the Commission and Council and at the Parliament, for have a more equal society, a more just society, and which can highlight the education of young girls and use their intelligence. The second point is in equality in posts of responsibility. You know, I'm French, and I was against quotas. But after 10 years, I have to say that without quotas, we won't succeed. Without quotas, we won't never have as many women as men in high posts. And last year, I heard the President of Parliament say he was suggesting that too. I think today we really need to go down that road. You know, I was against quotas because I think it's not right to protect women who, through their skills and competence, should be able to get there. But we need that now. Finally, third point. We also need to fight for equal pay between men and women. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. Papadopoulou for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Today we celebrate women's long struggle and their achievements. But we see that there are still shortages of democracy. There is poverty, there is sexual exploitation, there is unemployment of women, there is violence against women, there are continued stereotypes, and there is a lack of women at decision-making levels. So the people who suffer most now are single mothers, for example, or migrant workers who are women. So we need more effective policies to fight against poverty and to protect these women workers. Women need to be protected at their workplace and in their careers. We need energetic measures, we need quotas so that women are better represented in boards, for example. And we need also to fight against stereotypes. We need to educate because women deserve it.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ms. SENYSZYN for 1 minute.
Pani Przewodnicząca.
Madam President, women are discriminated in every walk of life. They are battered and raped. Every other female European has had experience of violence, and over 1 million feel it every day. Work is underway on the Violence Directive. Unfortunately, there are still countries, including Poland, where law-sanctioned violence is perpetrated against women because of lack of sexual education and easy access to contraceptives. Women, including underage women who are pregnant, are forced to give birth to a child. A pregnant woman is used as an incubator. She is deprived to decide of the right to decide about herself and her privacies that is incumbent with every male. The abortion ban does not decrease the number of actual abortions. Anti-abortion law has to be condemned because it is a form of state violence and against women and institutional discrimination of women. If men were to get pregnant, abortion would be a sacrament. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Steinruck is the next speaker for 1 minute. I cannot see Mrs. Steinruck in the chamber. The next speaker is Mrs. Garcia Perez for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Today my thanks and my recognition go to all the women who in the last 100 years Many of them been recognized, mentioned in books, but many of them also invisibly have worked to achieve the quotas that we have, the degree of equality that we have today, but there still remains a lot to be done. In this report we talk about things like the reconciliation of family life and working life, the difficulty of getting access to the working world, the gender inequality, which is one of the major social plagues of Europe and the world. Equality between men and women is still not a reality. So we need to start on a new stage. We need to move from commitments to realities. The European institutions and the rest of Europe's society now needs to advance to make sure that there is real equality between men and women, and that this can be the opportunity for a fairer, more egalitarian society, and we need men with us along that road. A lot remains to be done, and we shall have to achieve it together.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That brings us to the end of this debate. So we move on to the Catch the Eye procedure. I have to tell you, we have 20 requests for the floor. Normally, actually 21 now. Normally we would only have 5 minutes, as you know. That would be 5 speakers. I can double that to 10, but that's the absolute maximum. Because we do have a timetable, the commissioners will have to take the floor and both rapporteurs as well. And that means, unfortunately, that 10 will not get the floor. Anybody asking for the floor now will not get the floor. Yes, that would be 22, that would be 23. Only the first 10 will get the floor. The first speaker is Mrs. Joanna
Skrzydlewska. Ich muss mich entschuldigen.
Skrzydlewska.
Frau Skrzydlewska.
Dziękuję, pani przewodnicząca, pani komisarz, panie komisarz.
Thank you, Madam President, Commissioners. Today is the day to recall that people should be treated equally regardless of their gender. Despite actions taken for the equality, we have the outstanding issue of the gender pay gap. Women still have it more difficult for them because employers assess them not on the merit of their qualifications, but based on whether they're going to have children or not, and if they have them, who's going to take care of them when kids are ill. Such questions are not asked to men or fathers when they are employed. Therefore, I stress the need for systemic changes and to take actions which will change the perception of this issue among the general public, and which will free the women of their internal conviction that they're the only ones responsible for rearing children. So here I appeal to the European Commission to present a draft legislative proposals which would basically put some reins on the employers and therefore level out the inequalities. Given the charisma and the skills of Mrs. Reding, I believe that...
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Repo and then Mr. Weigl.
Arvoisa puhemies ja...
President, esteemed women colleagues, this International Women's Day, it's a good way to see that the real status of equality in Europe. We have a new concern, which is the feminization of poverty. Even though women do more work than women, when men get more pay and more pension, it's wrong that men get richer and women poorer. We have to help women, therefore, in all possible ways. Aging, in particular, the aging of women, will not be a burden. It shouldn't be seen as a burden. It should be seen as a richness of and resource of Europe. Colleagues, the future of the world and Europe will be more and more resting on women. But of course it's good that all boys and men and Mr. Bloom and I have better things to do than going to war. So my congratulations.
Redner ist Herr Weigl.
The next speaker is Mr. Weigl and then Mrs. Zaborska.
Weigl.
Spoštovana gospa predsedujoča.
Madam President, in the Vienna Philharmonic, we certainly have the best classical orchestra in the world. A few years ago, it opened its doors to women. Just imagine what the orchestra in this house would sound like if there were no women playing in it. to encourage us with their temperament and to provide their qualifications and their knowledge. Today is to remind us of the inequality that affects women, so it's more than necessary. Women don't have the same wages. Women always end up losing out from childcare. Our duty today here and in the national parliaments is to ensure that there is equality through legislation. But we can also do that through the attitude that we demonstrate towards the women that we work with every day.
Mrs. Zaborska is the next speaker, and then Mrs. Rapti.
Madam Chair, Madam Commissioner, Mr. Commissioner, it is very important that we speak about the poverty of women on this very day, but at the same time it is a pity that when searching for solutions we are still captivated and taken captive by unilateral way of thinking, and I dare to say obsolete way of thinking, because the solution of the issue of women's poverty is not the forceful intervention into their family environment. The most recent OECD research points out to the fact that this intervention has only a limited success. Women mothers devote more time to household chores and care for the children than men do, and even in case when the man makes use of the parental leave, not because the women must do that, but because women want to do that, and they rather prefer the part-time employment. According to OECD figures, 30 to 50% of all economic activities are not reflected in present-day measurements of welfare, such as the example, the gross domestic product per capita. The solution of poverty of women is thus the recognition of work that the women will create within the solidarity of generations.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I want to say something different. I don't see this as a day of celebration. It's a day of commemorating and paying homage to victims, women and men, of the revolution in the US 157 years ago, and that's something we shouldn't forget. If we want to make further progress, there are three basic things that have to be done. First of all, support for women who are working, creches, kindergartens. Then, Commissioner Andor, there has to be economic support for women. And thirdly, there needs to be a change in the traditions in schools. And there, Mrs. Reding, I would suggest that quotas are brought in, not just for the management boards of companies, because that is as if we're locking the door after the horse has bolted. We have to make sure that we have more women to make sure that there is equality between the genders. So, to conclude, I'm asking you to give the floor to all those who've asked for it, despite what the rules say, because today it is, after all, a very important day. Well, perhaps I can make this clear once again. You've just taken the floor. We have a rule that we have catch-the-eye progress that is applied for 5 minutes. There are 23 colleagues who have asked for the floor. I'm giving the floor to 10 people. We have a very clear agenda. We're already bursting the borders of what we're meant to do, so I would ask and beg your indulgence on this point. Mrs. Lunacek's the next speaker.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, here in the plenary, in the gallery, rights for women at work, in family, in democracy, the economic independence for women, the fighting against violence, discrimination of single parents, lesbian women and immigrants is a fight that's been going on for too long. We're celebrating 100 years of Women's Day. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we'll be able to celebrate that in future, the achievements that we've achieved. But what's lacking? Mrs. Monier said that 10 years ago she didn't believe in quotas, but now she does. I think it's necessary, and I thank you for this, because quotas are something without which women won't make it. We have men's quotas in boards, in all bodies, in politics, in education. The men's networks work without any problem. Men aren't there. Many are, not because of their achievements, many because they're part of an old boys' networks. That's why we need quotas and equal pay.
Next speaker is Mr. Salavrakos, and after him we have Mrs. Ronzulli.
Thank you, Madam President. Today is particularly important. Women's Day, these women that we love and respect, these mothers and wives and sisters, women who work and women who stay at home. I should like to say to all of these women how thankful I am to them, and to say that personally I support women's fight for equality in society, at the workplace, their fight for the same wages and salaries and the same responsibilities with no violence and no exploitation. And that's all I have to say. I'm grateful to you once again, all you women present and absent.
The next speaker is Mrs. Ronzulli, and then we have Mr. Brons.
Grazie Presidente.
Thank you.
Una dedica speciale a tutte le donne che combattono ogni giorno per il rispetto dei propri diritti.
To all the women who are fighting for their rights in a modern society, and I dedicate it to women who choose to have a child, although they recognize that it's going to be difficult to reconcile working with their new role as a mother. To all the women who, with their capacity and their knowledge, decide to make their own road in society despite all the obstacles. That's why I think, initially at least, we need women's quotas as a way of breaking with a society that only counts on men. This is something that a lot of young women have been waiting a long time for. With their cultural preparation and their professional training, they won't let this opportunity go past them. I hope that my daughter is not going to have to fight against the glass ceiling as we do, and I hope that women in her day will be seen as a real added value.
Thank you. I think we share those sentiments. Mr. Brons, 1 minute.
Thank you. It's the Trotskyists who transformed Marxist class warfare into multi-grievance group warfare. Society was to be segmented into groups who might or might not have known that they had a grievance until that was explained to them by helpful young militants. The groups might be defined by ethnicity, religion, sex, sexuality, age or disability. They were all to be urged to engage in collective action against their oppressors. The Trotskyists grew older, if not up, and in some cases they moved into positions of power and influence. Their ideas spread much faster and further than they did. The word discrimination, when followed by the word against, became the ultimate evil. In many cases, there's no identifiable perpetrator. The discriminator is the rest of society. We're all guilty. People, whatever their real disadvantage, must realise when they're being manipulated and must shake off that manipulation. Thank you.
The final speaker under the Catch the Eye process, Mrs. Kadenbach.
Präsidentin,
Vážená pani predsednička, vážená pani komisárka, vážený pán komisár.
Innehaltens und Bilanzziehens. Und ich möchte mich heute auch bei unseren Pionierinnen, bei den Wegbereiterinnen bedanken, die es möglich gemacht haben, dass in der Zwischenzeit so viele Frauen teilhaben am politischen Geschehen, dass so viele Frauen Möglichkeit haben, teilzuhaben am wirtschaftlichen System. Aber ich glaube, dieser Tag muss auch eine Mahnung sein, dass das, was bis jetzt errungen wurde, nicht aufs Spiel gesetzt wird. Und wenn ich mir so anschaue, die Programme in den einzelnen Mitgliedstaaten.
Or jeopardize that. And the idea of budget consolidation should not impinge against what women need in terms of the rights for equality, for a right to have an individual income and sharing in political developments as well. Now, luckily there are a few men here as well. It's a question of striking up a common partnership to implement our ambitious goals, to make sure that Women's Day in future will be a genuine celebration. Thank you very much. Now on behalf of the Commission, Mrs. Reding.
Merci, Madame le Président.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you to you, Members of Parliament, because I've got the message loud and clear, and I can summarise it in one sentence. The majority of you will no longer accept the 90% of men in the upper echelons of our companies, and you think that that has to change. So let's work together so that that changes.
After having heard your rapporteur and having heard all the interventions, I analyse what has been said. I think we do agree that women do reasonably well in politics, reasonably well. There is still a long way to go, but we are on the right track. Unfortunately, we do not reasonably well in economy. We are absent in decision making, and I got your message, we want to change that. We are present in low income jobs, although 60% of the university graduates are females. So they are lost in the way to where we would need them in times of crisis in order to make things economically go better. And I tell you, we have no choice. How do you want us to reach the 75% of employability, if not by the untapped potential of these well-trained women? So we really need to change our way of tackling employment, our way of giving women a chance, our way of bringing the talent which we have trained, which we have educated, which is available also to our employment. And then I have also very well heard the interventions for the victims. It is true, victims are not only females, they are not only children, they are also men, but mainly victims are female, are small girls. And that is why in the victims package, which I will present in the month of May, this fact is going to be taken into consideration. We are celebrating shortly after this 100 years of the Women's Day. We should not forget that we are celebrating in those days also 100 years of Marie Curie getting the Nobel Prize. And I would like to say to all the women inside this room, we should be proud to be women.
Vielen Dank, Frau Reding.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Reding. I now give the floor to Commissioner Andor.
Thank you very much, honourable members. I believe that 100 years struggle and the 100 years progress has to be respected. But we also have to acknowledge that contemporary Europe is still far from full equality between men and women. And much of these inequalities are reproduced through the imbalances of the labour markets, the bias against women in many, many segments, many institutions within the labour markets. And that's why I believe that the European policies and the European financial instruments will have to act in order to improve the situation in this area, to improve the employment opportunities and the employment conditions of women in order to make progress. There are many concrete actions which is possible. For example, when we speak about the European funds, wherever it is possible and reasonable, an equal opportunities conditionality is very important, which we want to pursue. But direct job creation is also important. One of the key directions of job creation in the coming decade is the so-called white jobs, jobs in healthcare, long-term care, where we have to focus on creating opportunities, because much of this work is done anyway by women, but without a proper remuneration, without an opportunity to accumulate rights, including pension rights for old age. Speaking about pensions, in fact, in the white paper on pensions, which is forthcoming in the third quarter of this year, we will pay more attention to the gender dimension of this. There is a group of commissioners working on this pension white paper, and with Vice President Reding participating and contributing, we will manage to address the gender dimension of pensions more forcefully than in the previous Green Paper. I agree with Frau Zimmer. This is also a question of regulating working time. It's absolutely fundamental, and we need a working time regulation in the EU which allows for a better accommodation of working needs and family responsibilities. A better work-life balance is absolutely essential. This is part of our decent work agenda, and I agree with those who highlighted that this is not only an issue that applies inside the EU, this is an international responsibility which we have to pursue. And just highlighting one more connection, which is the connection between the labour market and education. We have to go deep in order to improve the quality of education, to raise awareness, to teach about rights, including women's rights, and especially, this is very important for the European minorities, whether there are immigrants or other ethnic minorities. Finally, on the question of the boards and the question of quotas in corporate boards. I had an opportunity last week to discuss this question with the new head of the Confederation of the British Industry. I'm sure Mr. Bloom would be interested to hear that. And there are many aspects of this question, but apart from the stereotypes and the organisation and cultural aspects, this discussion also highlighted the need to organise family life differently because of the time demand of leading jobs. So that's why we have to act on many fronts. We shouldn't accept that it's only the working life, only the public life where we have to extend the discussion to, and I believe that if we continue this discussion and the Commission efforts with the due responsibility, we can make progress in the future. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Andor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Andor. Now, to conclude, we have the two rapporteurs. First of all, Mrs. Nedelcheva, for 2 minutes.
Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President, Commissioner Reding, Commissioner. I'd like to thank all contributors to the debate. Today's debate shows once again how keen we all are on the subject of equality. We all share common values and principles: respect for human dignity, fighting inequality, fighting discrimination. I have every respect for the national and sometimes personal connotation that everyone has and brings to these values. That's part of Europe's wealth. But these differences shouldn't make us lose sight of what we have in common. We have to go on working for the women's condition, both in on the personal level, at the workplace and in their families. We must continue encouraging their access to the world of work, above all to posts of responsibility. Institutions, political bodies, companies all need to be made more responsible in this direction. It's our job for all of us to make sure that these things can be achieved. It's been said several times today. Fighting inequality between men and women is everybody's everyday struggle. We need strong political determination leading to specific actions. I welcome everything the Commission has announced, and I would like to thank all my colleagues for the support that they will be giving us in the future. Then there's another thing. People have criticized the text, which apparently is getting longer year by year. But is that surely not because the previous recommendations have not been fully put into effect? Let's make sure that they are. I also think that the complexity of the question and its dynamic evolution is partly responsible. That we have to keep up with these things. We have to move beyond old ideas. Lastly, I think equality between men and women is everybody's affair. It's up to the free will of each of us to take awareness of it and achieve it. 2011 is the European Volunteering Year. Let's make sure that equality between men and women is our greatest initiative this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the rapporteur now, Mrs. Plum.
Very much, President. I would like to thank the Commissioner Reding, the Commissioner Andor, for their strong commitments on these important issues. I would like to thank to all my colleagues for their strong messages on this important debate today. First of all, I would like to say that gender equality is not only a matter of social justice, but it's a matter for progress, and we need to build together a fair society for all of us. Then, I would like to say that I strongly support the quotas. Yes, we need the women in the top positions, but let's not forget the poverty. We have to tackle, we have to prevent and to reduce the poverty, and we need concrete measures. By preventing and reducing the poverty, this is an important component of social solidarity, and I strongly believe in women's solidarity. We need the support for all of the citizens. We need the support from the whole society, and I would like to thank to the NGOs, to the social partners, to all women and men in the society who are fighting year by year, day by day, to achieve the gender equality. We have to make this gender equality to become a reality. We can accelerate on the track today. Let's make together things happen. And I wish again to all women happy days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That winds up the joint debate. The vote on the two reports will be today at 12. Now, colleagues, representatives of Council and Commission, I'd like to adjourn this sitting for a moment so that the formal sitting can be prepared to wind up the 100th anniversary of International Women's Day. The President of the European Parliament will be here in a moment, and all of us here in this House, in the Commission and the Council, who are women, will then be asked to take part in a joint photo after the ceremony. I hope that all colleagues listening in the offices will hear this message and come into plenary. So we'll adjourn for a moment before the formal ceremony.